The mayor of Ottawa says the city is facing a financial mess, but he pins the blame elsewhere. First, on the federal government, which doesn't pay property tax on its many buildings in Ottawa. Instead, it sends payments that it thinks reflect the value of those properties. 8 years ago, the feds transferred $194 million. That amount has dropped to $164 million. Ottawa is also raising concerns about its transit post-COVID. The blue line represents ridership in Ottawa since 2019, while the red reflects the rest of the country. Ridership has not nearly recovered in Ottawa to the degree other cities have. And the mayor says as a result, the city's long-term transit finances have a huge hole due to the loss of those fare revenues. Mark Sutcliffe is the mayor of Ottawa, and he joins me now. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, JP. It's a pleasure to be here.
So how bad is the fiscal picture in this city? You suggested it's pretty bad. How big a hole do we have in the budget?
It's a big hole, and it's happened for a couple of different reasons. So we're facing over the next few years a shortfall of $140 million a year in our public transit budget. We've had holes in the public transit budget before, but the problem just keeps getting worse for a couple of reasons. Number one, ridership is down in Ottawa, and it's worse than in other cities because we have a lot of federal government employees who used to come downtown to go to the office, and now they're working in a hybrid arrangement, which I accept and respect. I've never asked the federal government to do anything differently. But if we're going to have a different situation with downtown Ottawa going forward, we need to acknowledge the impact that's having on our transit system. The other reason is we don't get the same deal as other cities like Toronto when it comes to the costs of building transit. So the Eglinton Crosstown project in Toronto was paid 100% by other levels of government. Toronto taxpayers, through their municipal taxes, did not pay anything towards the construction cost. Here in Ottawa, for Phase 2 of light rail, local taxpayers are paying 56% of the cost of building that project. So we don't get the same deal as other cities. And then the other issue that I brought up last week is the fact that the federal government owns an enormous amount of real estate in Ottawa. They own about half of the office buildings in downtown Ottawa, and they don't pay property taxes. They're supposed to give us a payment every year that's about what they would pay in property taxes if those were privately owned buildings. But they get to decide how much that payment is, and they've been cutting it back and cutting it back and cutting it back and shifting the burden of those costs for municipal services that they use to local taxpayers, and that's just not fair.
So the Prime Minister and the Premier were asked yesterday about your request maybe for some more assistance, some more funding. Let's play you that tape and get your reaction to it on the other side.
The federal government will always look to be a partner of municipalities as we move forward, particularly a municipality that's so geographically important to the federal government as Ottawa. We look forward to continuing to work with Mark.
You know, we're in, if the federal government's in, they're the largest employer in the region, so I'll leave it at that. We'll talk to Mayor Sutcliffe and work with the federal government.
So it's not just those two. We also heard from Jenna Sudds, who's the cabinet minister in Trudeau's government, kind of responsible for Ottawa. She's the point person. She released a statement suggesting that there will not be really any change to the fiscal arrangement as it is, saying that the government expects Ottawa to manage its money well and spend wisely. So at this point, a bit of an icy reception, if you will, from the feds in the province and the minister who's actually maybe going to deliver on this request. What do you make of their coolness to your idea of getting more money from these other levels of government?
I wouldn't describe it that way. I was encouraged by what the Prime Minister said yesterday, and we did meet in April at Ottawa City Hall, and we had a good discussion about these exact issues, and he was very understanding of the situation in Ottawa, and this is the national capital, and our challenges are unique, and I think the Prime Minister understands and respects that. We heard the Premier saying he's in if the federal government is in. I take that as an encouraging sign. I think there is a way forward, and I remain an optimist. Jenna Sudds has always been a great representative for Ottawa, and I have a great working relationship with her. I would just say we have been managing our finances at the City of Ottawa very, very carefully. We've found $153 million in savings and efficiencies over the last couple of years to keep our costs under control, so we have as much money as possible, as many resources as possible to put towards priorities like public transit.
If they don't come through, though, with this extra cash that you're asking for, you have raised the possibility of increasing taxes. I think that you also said there could be enormous transit fare hikes as well if the governments don't deliver. How big a tax increase are you considering for property owners in the city?
At this point, we're not considering any significant property tax increase beyond what we would normally do. What I'm describing, though, is that we don't run anything but balanced budgets at the municipal level. We're not allowed to run deficits. So we have to find either savings in the form of service cuts, or we have to increase our revenues in the form of property tax increases and fare increases to cover the shortfall that I described earlier, the $140 million shortfall. So if we don't get help from other levels of government, we would be looking at an increase in the transit levy of 37%, which would translate into a 7% property tax increase on top of the normal property tax increase we would have for all the other services we provide in the city. So I don't want to do that, and I hope we don't have to do that, because I think there is a way forward with the federal and provincial governments.
Yeah, because I was actually looking at how Ottawa compares on property tax rates to cities across the country, and we already pay some of the highest, really, among the highest in the country. Calgary, 0.66%, Vancouver, 0.28%, Montreal, 0.59%, and even after Mayor Chow in Toronto pushed through a fairly sizable increase to property taxes, they're only 0.67%. Here in Ottawa, we're just over 1%. So we're already among the most highly taxed cities in terms of property owners. Is there really room? Is there an appetite among people to see even more of an increase if we're already paying about 30% more in property taxes than Toronto just down the highway?
So just to be clear, I think the number you're quoting there is the rate against the value of the property.
Right.
Other cities have seen significant property tax increases in the last few years, while we have kept our property tax increases to 2.5% each year for the last 2 years, because we've heard from residents that they already feel their property taxes are too high. In the municipal election campaign 2 years ago, I promised to keep tax increases to 2.5% a year for the first 2 years, and as close as possible to that for years 3 and 4 of my mandate. The main opponent that I ran against in that election campaign, Catherine McKenney, promised something very, very similar. So the vast majority of Ottawa residents, almost 90% of Ottawa residents, voted for either Catherine McKenney or me, and they wanted to see modest property tax increases. And what I promised to do was to act in a fiscally responsible and balanced way to find savings and efficiencies without cutting services. And we did that. We found $153 million in savings and efficiencies without cutting programs and services, so that we could keep property taxes as low as possible at a time when residents are facing an affordability crisis. The cost of everything is going up, and we can't add to that burden by ramping up property taxes severely.
So even though there is this fiscal hole, you're committed to keeping property tax increases to no more than 2.5% for the current schedule, and then it might be considerably more, I guess, in the years 3 and 4 of your mandate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so for 2023 and 2024, we kept property tax increases to 2.5%. I want to keep them as low as possible to respect the affordability crisis our residents are experiencing for 2025 and 2026. But if we're forced to find new sources of cash in order to pay for transit, we don't want to destroy our public transit system or dramatically cut service. We may have to look at higher than normal property tax increases if we don't get the help from the federal and provincial governments. But I don't think it comes, I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. And to me, this is not just about asking for a handout, it's a matter of essential fairness. The federal government hasn't been paying its fair share of property taxes to the City of Ottawa for years. We're short $100 million, almost $100 million, looking at the 2025 budget compared to what they normally would have paid us years ago. And the provincial government and the federal government have been paying more for transit in Toronto than they pay for in Ottawa. So it's about fairness.
You mentioned efficiencies, and you've been able to find, as you say, tens of millions of dollars already. But you ran as sort of a fiscal moderate in the last election, as you said, keeping tax rate increases relatively low. Why don't you look for more cuts as opposed to pursuing a potential tax increase? I know I was looking at the numbers of employees that the City of Ottawa has, and we do have proportionately more in this city, more city bureaucrats than even Toronto does. There's 16,000 roughly in the City of Ottawa for 1 million people. In Toronto, there's about 42,000 city employees with a population of 3 million. So is there some room that you could trim there? Would you be open to maybe reducing the size of the bureaucracy in the city as opposed to pushing through larger tax increases for property owners?
We continue to look for ways to find savings and efficiencies without cutting programs and services. That's always a priority. We have a working group that is continuing to work on exactly that. So we're always going to be looking for savings and efficiencies. I would point out that Ottawa is 4.5 times the geographic size of Toronto. It's an incredibly large and diverse city. We have a huge rural component to the city, a suburban component, a downtown component. People don't realize you can fit Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Calgary inside Ottawa and still have room left over. So we have some costs that other cities don't have. When it comes to policing and transit and fire service, we have to cover a much larger area. So there are always going to be, it sometimes is comparing apples to oranges when we talk about those ratios, but we're always going to look for savings and efficiencies and take a proper balanced approach to our finances.
Okay, let's leave it there. Mark Sutcliffe is the Mayor of Ottawa. Thanks for coming in, sir.
My pleasure, JP. Thank you.